Everything you're about to hear is for education and entertainment purposes only. Whilst we are licensed, we're not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Any advice is general advice. Equity Mates operates under Australian Financial Services Licence 540697.
Equity Mates!
I will say this about investing. Everything you do learn is cumulative. What I learned at 20 is useful.
Equity.
Welcome to another episode of Equity Mates, a podcast where we explore what's possible on the world of investing. If you've just joined us for the first time, a huge welcome to Equity Mates. Today we continue our superannuation series. To chat through it, as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you?
I'm very good, Bryce. A little bit thrown by your intro. Normally we explore what's possible in the world of investing,
What did I say?
but now I guess we're on top of the world because we explore what's possible on the world of investing.
Hey, I'm just keeping it real, and I'm glad you're paying attention.
It's those little quirks you pick up after 1,000 and something episodes together.
Goodness me.
But look, let's not get too derailed because we've got a big episode today. This is our second of 3 episodes in our superannuation series, proudly supported by Vanguard Super. In our first episode, we spoke about why super, why we think it's important, why it's the only free kick you're going to get with your finances, and why it's the foundation of our retirements here in Australia. In this episode, we're getting very practical. This is the toolbox episode. What are the tools at our disposal? What are the levers that we can pull to maximize the amount of super that we have when we retire? And we're not doing it alone.
We're not doing it alone, Ren. We're going to bring in an expert from Vanguard. Aidan Geysen will be joining us. He's the senior manager at Vanguard Super to help us chat through the toolkit. So in this episode, we're going to cover some of the basics around setting up super, what criteria matters when choosing a super fund, how do we find information and answer each criteria, how to compare super funds, and then have a look at some of the additional resources to help you.
But before we get to Aidan, we want to say a massive thank you to Vanguard Super for making this series possible. You probably all know Vanguard's award-winning ETFs, but did you know Vanguard Super is winning awards too?
Vanguard Super is backed by 45 years of global investment expertise, plus it's low cost, so you keep more of what's yours.
The Vanguard Super Lifecycle product has one of the lowest super fees on the market, now more than 30% lower than the industry average. Whether you're just starting your career or planning your retirement, Vanguard has you covered.
So head to vanguard.com.au/super to explore Vanguard Super.
Fee comparison based on super rating smart data as at 31 March 2024. Other fees and costs may apply. Vanguard Super Pty Ltd is the trustee of Vanguard Super. Read the relevant PDS and TMD available at vanguard.com.au/super and consider if a product is right for you before making any financial decisions.
Well, Aidan, welcome to Equity Mates.
Thanks, Bryce and Alec. Great to be here.
Today we're covering off the toolkit that we need when it comes to setting up our superannuation fund and the basics to consider. And that's where we want to start. So what are some of the basics to consider when it comes to superannuation?
Very happy to get into that. One thing I would say first is that our system, unlike many around the world, is sort of set up to make a number of those key decisions for those who are disengaged. And by and large, that'll put most at a decent starting point to save for retirement. But there are some actions that I think are worth talking about that help beyond that. So, firstly, I would say have just one account. That's really easy these days. The ATO has an online consolidation tool. People can log in and do that themselves. Most funds have that functionality as well. It's normally just a couple of clicks. But surprisingly, despite how easy it is, there's still around 4 million members with multiple accounts who are paying higher fees.
Wow.
Particularly given a number of funds charge fixed admin fees as well. So obviously, if you've got multiple accounts, you're paying that more than once. You're not capitalising on those benefits of scale. That's the first one. That's an easy one.
Yeah, and I'm going to put my hand up, and I had multiple accounts from just different jobs, when you're young and you work in casual jobs. And yeah, it was so easy to consolidate. And it was one of those things that I put off for so long because I thought it would be hard, and it was literally a couple of clicks.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you're used to these things being complex, but once you jump on, that's an easy one. So good place to start. The second one I'd say is don't just take the employer default. And the caveat I'd put in there is without checking. Often the employer default, might be a really well set up fund for someone's needs. And again, like super's been set up such that if you are completely engaged, like there is a path of least resistance that works pretty well. If you do nothing, you'll end up with a super fund, an asset allocation that'll help you save for retirement, and minimum guaranteed contributions coming from your employer. So like that's a really decent start. But for many members, it means they miss an important opportunity to become engaged in saving and investing for retirement. So doing your homework around whether that fund is right for you, and we can get into some of the things to consider there.
So, Aidan, what else do we need to consider when it comes to the basics?
Yeah, probably the last thing to call out here is this is just so simple, but making sure you're being paid. Industry Super Australia actually had some interesting estimates that over the last 7 years, 10.8 billion in super wasn't paid to Australians. Like that's not far off $1,000 for every worker. Yeah. And obviously for those that are missing out, that number can be much higher.
It's just crazy to think there's so much money.
Yeah.
And, in the first episode of this series, we spoke about how many Australians aren't engaging with their superannuation. And so you sort of put those two facts together and you sort of realise that a lot of Australians aren't engaging with their superannuation. And then there's, in some pockets of the economy, underpayment of super. And it's like that a lot of Australians probably just wouldn't know because they're not engaging.
Absolutely.
So there's some good basics, and we'll include the ATO online consolidation tool as a link in the show notes. So consolidate, make sure you've just got one fund. Make sure you're happy with that fund. Don't just take a default without checking, and then make sure you are being paid into that fund. So that's some good basics and some good groundwork. I guess where we wanted to go in this episode is really to build a set of criteria and understand how we choose the right fund. And obviously, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer for everyone, but we'd love to get some sort of general points which we can all go away and think about for our own personal circumstances and figure out what fund is right for us. So as we're building a criteria, Aidan, where would you start? What are some of those key points that we should all consider?
Yeah, so some of the key things, and we can expand on these later, like firstly, low fees. And you guys know fees matter. Whether it's investments or superannuation, the more you pay for, the less you get to keep of your investments. So that's just fundamental. In terms of the investment options, really important to establish your goals and time horizon, as well as any personal preference, whether that can be around ESG, DIY type options. That'll help narrow down those choices. Long-term performance, really important to sort of look long-term when you're assessing performance. We'd say at least 5 years, but really the longer the better, so preferably more. And then also, on the attached to super, often is insurance as well, so looking into the insurance offer.
Yeah, well, let's start with unpacking the fees side of things, because as you noted, here at Equity Mates, we hate fees. And as you also said, like the more you're paying in fees over the long time, you're just eating into and degrading returns. So lower fees, the lower the fee, the better. When it comes to super fund fees, what should we be looking for? What elements make up the fees? And help us understand more about the fee structures.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that easy to understand, so definitely worth spending time on. And all super funds charge fees. The components that tend to make up the total fee is admin fees, investment fees, transaction costs. And our research has found that 1 in 2 Australians are unsure how much they're paying for their super. And I think partly because the way fees are charged, it's not that easy to work out. So really important to sort of wrap your arms around what all the different fees are, how they're charged, and get a view of that total cost, so that when you are comparing them, you can add it all up. And you might have to dive into the PDS to sort of find all of that detail. ATO comparison tool also has sort of some information that looks at what a member may cost, but again, there'll be assumptions embedded in that, around member balance and things like that. So PDS is often a good source of truth. So that one might require a little bit of digging.
Yeah. We'll include the Your Super comparison tool in the show notes as well. I think it's a good starting point. But yeah, you're right. It still can be confusing. It's you've still got to sometimes do the maths yourselves. And I know for some funds, there's some fees that are a fixed dollar amount and then some that are a percentage. And so you've got to sort of calculate it yourself.
Yeah, and that just adds to the complexity as well. Certainly our approach around fees, is to be transparent, have a simpler approach where it is an asset-based fee and then disclosing that, there are components to that, but disclosing that on a total cost basis. But really, generally around fees, the lower the better. I think it was Albert Einstein who said that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. Those who understand it earn it, and those who don't pay it. And whilst he said this in relation to the interest earned, like that math also works in the opposite direction. So if you're compounding the effective fees saved on an investment, that makes a big difference over time. It's a couple of years old now, but the Productivity Commission looked into this when they're looking at the sort of efficiency of the super system. And if you can save just 0.5% for a typical worker over their working life, it adds up to around 12% of their super balance.
Wow.
Or around $100,000 by the time they reach retirement. And that's for a 0.5% difference.
Wow.
So fees definitely matter.
That's a good start.
That is a really good
12% of your balance.
Yeah.
Jeez.
The difference between 0.5% and 1% just doesn't look massive.
It doesn't feel,
on the paper when you're looking at it when you're 20 and you're just choosing a super fund. But when you say that difference can be worth $100,000 in your retirement, like that's massive.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and I think average fees for industry and retail funds are somewhere between 1 and 1.1%. 1.1% if you can get a fee of, and that's the average. So it's perfectly achievable, to save that 0.5% just by looking around.
Well, that's shocked me. So that's the first one. Number one criteria, low fees. That's something that we can all check and we all should be checking with our super fund. The second one is investment options. And I think this has probably been, even just the time that we've been doing this podcast, the change in the number of issuers of super funds and the choices that are given within those funds is pretty amazing. But as with so many things when it comes to investing, more choice, more options can sometimes be a little bit paralyzing. So knowing what the choices are and then knowing what you want is pretty important. So let's talk about investment options. How do we approach it? What are our choices? And then how do we sort of figure out what's right for us?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think you've touched on an important principle around choice overload as well, that more choice doesn't necessarily mean better outcomes. But an important thing to consider when thinking about the investment choices, I think, is to start with 3 simple questions. When do I want to retire? Like ultimately, superannuation is to save for retirement. How do I want to retire? And how will I get there? And just about to refresh it, but we undertake a series called How Australia Retires, which looked at research surveying 1,800 Australians that found that while the average ideal retirement age for working age Australians is around 61 years old, there's massive variation across that group. And actually what tends to happen when you ask younger people when they want to retire, the answer is around sort of late 50s, 59, 60. By the time you get to that 35 to 54 age group, it's sort of crept out to around 62. And then those aged 55 to 75, where you're really looking at, am I ready to retire? It's pushed out to sort of 65 years old. So a really good place to start is, when do I want to retire? Because that then filters into, how you frame your plan. And a big part of that plan is the investment choice and the asset allocation attached to that investment choice. And assuming someone has the risk appetite to tolerate it, you definitely want to take advantage of having those higher growth assets earlier in your career when you've got the time horizon to sort of take on that risk. The second one is around how do I want to retire? So different people have different goals in in retirement. All of us want to obviously meet those basic living expenses. Then it's the level of, that sort of non-discretionary spending that we want in our goals, whether that's holidays or however that looks. And depending on your situation, those goals can relate to, bequest motives as well. So having that idea of the type of lifestyle you want, again, sort of filters into the investment option and the choice that you make. We would say if you want to have some assurances around the lifestyle you want in retirement, taking on that risk when you can at an early stage, being diversified, so you're really not gambling around those outcomes. Yeah, and the third is around, third question is around, how will I fund my ideal retirement as well? Will it be solely through your superannuation fund, or are there other investments such as property or an investment portfolio that you'd look to draw on? And interesting to note that 1 in 3 Australians expect to continue some form of work into retirement, and some believing that they'll not be able to afford retirement without that additional income. And this is actually a particular challenge if you're renting, given the cost of rents relative to, say, if you're relying on the age pension, but also for an increasing number of homeowners as well. Sort of interesting to note that the proportion of Australians aged 55 to 64 with an outstanding mortgage has tripled in recent decades too. So, really considering those factors can help you determine which fund you'll choose.
Yeah, so I guess that's the point, and how to round those 3 questions together: when you want to retire, how you want to retire, and then what you're going to fund. Because when it comes to choosing funds these days, there's the pre-built options that are very familiar to a lot of us, which is just that growth, balanced, conservative. But a lot of funds these days are adding in more. There's tilts to things like ethical, there's direct investments, different types of weightings. So is the point here to answer those 3 questions first, and then go away and look for the funds that have the right investment options for you based on the answers to those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And, even just thinking about a couple of the different categories of funds, typically for people earlier on in their working life, if it's an employer default or something they've gone and chosen, it might be a growth fund, for example, that you choose when you're in your 20s, fairly high proportion of growth assets relative to defensive assets. But it makes sense given that long horizon, but do a check-in every few years as well, just to assess if that fund still fits your risk profile. But you don't need to be near retirement and have too much risk on the table by still being invested in a growth fund. So important to check in. Or alternatively, there are life cycle funds that adjust that risk for you as you age, which, Vanguard has, we refer to as a glide path. And with that, the life cycle fund, for instance, adjusts from, for us, the day you turn 48 right up until age 82. So it's very incremental in the way that it de-risks. It recognises that at the point of retirement, you've still got a long time horizon. So ours continues to adjust and de-risk through retirement. And along that glide path, the investment is still structured to help savings grow. Early on, it sort of takes 90% allocation to equities. But then managing that risk as you're approaching retirement. And through managing that risk, also that actually sort of helps smooth out sort of consumption or what you're drawing from your account in the retirement.
So just to be clear with the life cycle product as well, because it's something that I don't feel like was around when I first started working, which, admittedly was over 10 years ago or so, but it feels like a reasonably recent product here in Australia anyway, in Australia. And so is the idea that, with your life cycle products, you change the investment allocation to assets automatically depending on my age. And so as Bryce sitting here just contributing to super, I don't need to worry about changing that allocation myself?
Yeah, absolutely. And your observation is right. Life cycle was certainly the minority in terms of the way people were retirement, and particularly around the defaults that were offered either through employers or industry funds. When you consider when super guarantee came through, people weren't retiring with large balances at that early phase, and the focus was all on that accumulation phase. And I think the issue is now that people are sort of getting to that retirement phase with large balances, their lifestyle really is more and more predominantly going to be funded through their superannuation balance, and they're much more sensitive to the level of risk that they might be taking as they're approaching retirement, to the point where, if you sort of look around people's retirement intentions, whether it was the sell down during COVID or whether it was the financial crisis, pushing out their retirement date because they found they had too much risk in their portfolio. And so de-risking, both towards that event but also through retirement, I think just lands people in a better spot to retire comfortably when they want to retire, rather than this situation where someone goes and engages a financial planner at that sort of important juncture, and the financial planner sort of sees them in a 70 or 80% growth fund and then de-risks them in one step, ready for retirement. And just depending on sort of sequencing of market returns at that time, that then becomes a bit of a lottery as to, to what extent that impacts someone's ability to retire comfortably.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So we've covered off the first two criteria, the low fees and the investment options. The third criteria is around performance. And you mentioned at the top, you want to be looking long term. You said at least 5 years, preferably more. Talk to us about how we look at performance, where we can get that information, and some of the rules of thumb when it comes to comparing funds.
I might start with the rules of thumb. And the first one is just definitely making sure you're comparing like with like. And in particular, looking at comparable levels of growth assets. The predominant source of return for an investment, isn't so much, those active tilts or the active decisions that are made, but it's what they refer to as the beta of the market. So what the market delivers you. And the biggest determinant of that return, particularly for someone investing in super, is the level of growth assets or equity risk, which is sort of that big driver of returns. So compare like with like. We spoke about disengagement, and I think, this is a point and something that you can engage in. And, disengagement in some ways can be good because it means people aren't necessarily overreacting to inevitable events that we should look through, like an equity market sell-off. But we're also seeing people disengage around things like performance. And APRA have brought in the performance test, and if a fund fails that, they need to write to their members. We're even seeing responses to members that are being written to and told they're in an underperforming fund. Like a very sort of limited proportion of those are actually switching and making a choice despite having been told that they're in an underperforming fund.
That's interesting. So those letters, because it was a big step for the government to make underperforming super funds do that. But you're saying those letters haven't been having a massive effect. Yeah,
and I can't remember the numbers, but there were some statistics on sort of switching behaviour among members in underperforming funds, and the level of action taken was lower than we expect to see. Not to say that test hasn't been effective, and I think it's probably been effective at driving consolidation. And looking at subsequent results of that test, you can see, less and less failures. So it's certainly been effective at sort of improving performance in the industry, but more evidence that, people could engage more around this topic of performance, particularly looking long-term and making sure you're comparing like for like.
I think it's such an important point, this looking at long-term performance. One of my favourite investing books is Margin of Safety by Seth Klarman, and he writes about the institutional performance derby. And essentially what he talks about is there's this whole world of asset allocators and, institutional fund managers who just chase recent performance. And a fund will have a really good year and a lot of money will flow to that fund, but then that fund has a bad year and another fund has a good year, and then they chase the new shiny thing, and all that happens is these money managers constantly underperform because they're chasing the new hot thing. And it's like, that is the thing we want to avoid with our super. We want to avoid who had the best year last year jumping there, and then someone else has a good year and you're constantly chasing last year's gains.
That is a great point. It's important for people to remember where they've got a competitive advantage, and particularly our market and most sort of developed markets around the world have a very high level of institutional ownership. So if you're sort of jumping around with your super expecting to beat some of those professional institutional investors, that's not necessarily going to work out well. And, particularly when it's your retirement that you're playing with there as well. But the competitive advantage that we do have is that time horizon, and being able to take market risk as long as someone has a risk appetite for that, particularly early on is a really powerful way to get a good start.
It's one as well that it's not sort of comparing funds to start with. You want to be looking at performance. It's as you're going as well, like 5 years in, 10 years in, you want to be making sure that your super fund is catching up. But the challenge that you face there as well is like, how long do you wait if you're in a fund that you might be underperforming a little bit before you then have to then pull the pin and be like, actually, this is underperforming. It's not just a one-off. So it's more just a comment around that you need to stay vigilant with keeping track of how your fund is performing, but also keeping in mind that there are up and down years and there is a time horizon there that you need to give it a bit of time. But it can be challenging.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think that speaks to sort of the benefits of being engaged and, the work that you do with your audience as well. There are always performance cycles. Any strategy is going to underperform. That's often the worst time to get out. So just sort of trying to understand that strategy. But you're right, recognising when enough's enough is important as well. But that's why we say focus on the long term.
Now, Aidan, we've covered 3 of the 4 key criteria. We've covered low fees. We've covered looking at your investment options and long-term performance. We're going to take a quick break here, and then on the other side of the break, we're going to talk about the 4th criteria, which was insurance, and then how we can put it all into effect. But before then, we want to pause and say a massive thank you to Vanguard Super for making this superannuation series possible.
Vanguard Super's lifecycle investment option is brilliantly designed for ease, automatically adjusting your investment mix as you get older.
What does that mean, though?
It means you can rest easy knowing your super is in steady hands. Vanguard Super leverage 45 years of global investment expertise to automatically de-risk your portfolio leading up to and during retirement. Intelligently designed to focus on growth investments in your younger years and gradually introduce more defensive investments as you age, decreasing your investment risk as you near retirement, all without you having to lift a finger.
Head to vanguard.com.au/super to explore Vanguard Super. Vanguard Super Pty Ltd is the trustee of Vanguard Super. Read the relevant PDS and TMD available at vanguard.com.au/super and consider if a product is right for you before making any financial decisions. Welcome back to Equity Mates. Today we are talking to Aidan Geysen from Vanguard Super, all about how we choose the right super fund. We've covered some of the basics at the start of this episode that we can all do, making sure we've just got one account, not taking an employer default without checking that we're happy with it, and making sure we're actually being paid our super. Then Aidan gave us some criteria for choosing the right fund. Low fees, what are the investment options, what's the long-term performance, and finally the insurance it offers. We've covered those first 3 criteria. Aidan, let's turn to insurance. I guess for people unfamiliar, maybe let's even just start with what insurance super funds can offer, and then let's get into how do we determine what's right for ourselves.
Yeah, so in terms of the types that can be offered, from a life insurance standpoint, talking about death cover, total and permanent disability, and then often income protection as well. Typically, it's up to the member as to whether they either opt in or if it's in a default scenario, opt out of insurance. So really down to the member to sort of assess their needs and from an insurance standpoint. And
then in terms of assessing, like what should we be looking at when it comes to the super to compare one to the other in terms of insurance?
Yes, and I think looking at super holistically, obviously it's not just insurance, but within the insurance offer, those items to compare around the premium rates, the amount of cover that you get, and any exclusions or definitions that might affect someone as well.
It's such an underrated aspect of super, like that people don't really think about the insurance. I mean, I guess that's just insurance generally. No one thinks enough about it until you
need it.
Until it's the only thing that you're thinking about. But yeah, I guess again, it's where are you at your stage in life? And, like speaking personally, I, don't have any dependents, don't have any kids or anything like that. So my insurance need is going to be very different to, what I hopefully need in 10 years. So it's, again, this thing of engaging with your super and constantly checking what you need at different stages of life.
Absolutely. No, I think you've hit the nail on the head that this is very much an individual one as well, because different people have different arrangements, whether that's through their employer or, other insurance arrangements. So, getting this one right really comes down to sort of individual needs.
One thing we did learn recently, we were speaking to a financial advisor who specialises in insurance, and he made the point that you can also look for insurance outside of super, and then if it's one of the types of insurance you mentioned earlier, there are instances where you can get your super fund to pay for it. So there is a bit more flexibility than just taking the default insurance arrangements, which I had no idea about. So I think it's worth just flagging that there as well.
So Aidan, we've covered off the key criteria when it comes to looking for the right fund for you. Where do we then go to actually compare funds against funds? Like, is there a tool available? What's the best place to go for information to actually then put these criteria against each other?
There is the ATO My Super comparison tool. There is a couple of key criteria that tool looks at, but really, to go deeper, I think to make an informed and engaged choice, it's probably then a case of going into the PDS and reading some of the finer print on that.
Yeah, it's
getting under the hood.
Yeah. All the information is always there. You just have to
got to get the spreadsheet out.
Get the PDS. Yeah. And I think for people who want to compare funds and with those 4 criteria, even just going to the issuer's website and there's so much information there. You do have to just do the work. So I guess, Aidan, as we sort of get towards the end of this episode, we've talked about the basics that we should all be doing. Then we've sort of spoken about the key criteria that we should all be thinking about and applying to our choice of super fund. Let's close out by just talking about some of the additional resources out there that we can all access and that we can all use to make the most informed decision possible when it comes to our super.
Yeah, so there are additional resources as well. Certainly things where we look at around the super ratings survey. Again, that's helpful to look at sort of longer term returns categorised by different levels of growth assets. Other comparison websites like CanStar and Finder. And I'd also put in there for people that are sort of looking to plan to understand how much their contributions might equate to in terms of wealth at retirement, and then the kind of income they could draw off that in retirement. ASIC's Money Smart website has retirement calculators. I would just say on those they're a helpful guide, but be aware that the assumptions may not relate to someone's situation. But certainly they're some of the resources that we think about.
The last one, and this is a particular bugbear for Bryce and I, is actually getting financial advice. And the recent Vanguard retirement study we were reading before this interview, and the stat from that was that almost 2 in 3 working age Australians have never engaged a financial advisor. And this is where our bugbear comes from, because I think if you surveyed them and asked them how many of them would like to engage a financial advisor, a lot of them would. We survey our audience here at Equity Mates every year, and I think it was something like less than 10% had a financial advisor and more than 60% wanted a financial advisor. So that's a structural inequality that we're not going to solve on this call. But I think if you can afford a financial advisor and you can access one, I think they're a great resource to make sure your super is optimised as well.
Yeah, and there is a sort of well-publicised advice gap that you've referred to. So it's not just about individuals sort of not seeking advice, but it's actually the number of advisors and the capacity to meet that need. But the quality of advice review that's underway at the moment is sort of looking at sort of some of the other things that can be done to help provide guidance. But the research that you referenced from Vanguard, How Australia Retires, probably one of the biggest takeaways from that it's worth calling out is, the earlier someone plans, the more confident they'll be at retirement. And that plan doesn't just mean a formal plan with an advisor, but even informally. So, thinking about the messages in here and, the education that you do for your audience, that's all helpful to start that planning process. In that research, that's been the biggest driver of retirement confidence is starting that planning journey early.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice to end on. Start early, and this is the key theme throughout this whole series that we're doing with Vanguard is the earlier you start and paying attention, the better. And some of the things that we've spoken about today are not overly complicated. You just need to sit down and actually pay attention and have a look. So that's the good news. You don't need to be a financial expert to actually act on what we've spoken about in our episode today.
Yeah. My biggest takeaway from what you just said there, Aidan, is that confidence is within people's grasp, because I think so many people are not confident now and feel like that they will never be confident about it. But I think engaging with your super, sitting down and thinking about some of the things we've spoken about, it's all possible, and you can be confident that you're on the right track.
Yeah, very much so.
So we just want to say a massive thank you to Vanguard Super for supporting this superannuation series. Backed by 45 years of global investment expertise, Vanguard Super offers Australians a simpler, smarter option when it comes to their financial future.
Whether you're just starting your career or planning your retirement, Vanguard has you covered. Head to vanguard.com.au/super to explore Vanguard Super.
Vanguard Super Proprietary Limited is the trustee of Vanguard Super. Read the relevant PDS and TMD available at vanguard.com.au/super and consider if a product is right for you before making any financial decisions. But Aidan, a massive thank you for coming on to the show today. We do really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through some of those simple things that we can do and ensure that we're ticking those boxes when it comes to setting up our super correctly and helping to choose the right one. So thank you so much.
No, thank you both. It was a pleasure.
You have been listening to an Equity Mates Media production. In the spirit of reconciliation, Equity Mates Media acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. This podcast is intended for education and entertainment purposes. Any advice is general advice only and has not taken into account your personal financial circumstances, needs, or objectives. Before acting on general advice, you should consider if it is relevant to your needs and read the relevant product disclosure statement. And if you're unsure, please speak to a financial professional. The hosts of this podcast and their guests may have positions in the companies mentioned. Equity Mates Media operates under an Australian Financial Services Licence 540697.